If you're new to using hand planes, it can be very easy to become confused and overwhelmed by the wide variety available. The 1934 printing of the Stanley tool catalog alone offered over 20 different bench plane models. And this doesn't even include the block planes, the joinery planes, or other specialty planes. But the Stanley catalog was designed to sell tools, not teach people how to use them. So the catalog isn't such a great resource for learning how to use bench planes. To really understand what the different bench planes were intended to do, it helps to go back a couple hundred years before Stanley. The first book written in English that we know of that details the use of the different bench planes was written by Joseph Moxon in the late 1600s. In Moxon's book, only 3 bench planes are needed. These 3 planes are the fore plane or jack plane, the joiner plane, and the smoothing plane. Over the next few videos, I'll try to provide a basic understanding of how these 3 planes are set up and used for traditional woodworking. In this video, I'll discuss the fore plane. But before we get into how the fore plane is set up and used, let's take a second to clear up some confusion about terminology. Throughout this course, you'll hear me refer to the fore plane and jack plane interchangeably. This is a historically accurate use of both terms. In recent years, there's been a bit of misinformation and confusion surrounding the jack plane and fore plane. Now, my opinion on the source of this confusion is that it came from the Stanley tool catalog, where they described their number 6 fore plane as simply a short jointer plane. However, this is a historically inaccurate use of a fore plane. Now, Stanley's number 6 fore plane can certainly be used as a short joiner, but using the plane as a short joiner is not a historically accurate use of a fore plane. If we go back to historical texts, such as Moxon's book that I mentioned earlier, it's clear that the fore plane and the jack plane are in fact the same tool. In fact, in Moxon's book on page 161, he writes, "Jack plane, called so by carpenters, but is indeed the same that joiners call the fore plane." Randall Holm also wrote in his description from the same time period, "The jack plane called so by the carpenter is the same that joiners call the fore plane." So now that we understand that the fore plane and the jack plane are in fact the same tool, what is this tool used for? Well, again, if we go back to our historical information, Moxon says, "It is called the fore plane because it is used before you come to work either with the smooth plane or with the jointer." Moxon goes into great detail on the setup, sharpening, and use of the fore plane, taking over 4 pages to describe it. I'll save you the long version and offer this paraphrase. As Moxon describes, the fore plane is the first plane used when dressing rough lumber. The goal of the fore plane is to remove lumber as quickly as possible and bring the board into a general state of flatness before moving on to finer set tools like the jointer or smoothing plane. To facilitate taking a relatively thick cut without tearing up the surface of the board, the fore plane or jack plane is sharpened with a relatively heavy camber, as we discussed in the section on sharpening. I like my fore or jack plane to have enough camber that I can take a shaving with a thickness between a 32nd and a 16th of an inch without the corners of the blade digging in. And you can see here what this amount of camber looks like. As we get into our project later, I'll show you how to use the jack plane in the traditional manner. For now, just understand that the jack plane was historically meant for relatively rough but fairly quick work. So if you generally prepare your rough sawn lumber using machines, you may not even need a jack plane, except in cases where the board width exceeds the capacity of your machines. But if you don't have any machines for processing rough sawn lumber, the fore plane or jack plane is going to be one of your most used planes, especially if you don't buy your lumber already surfaced.